Okay, in this video, this is our introductory video to actual arguments. We're going to explain a little bit about what arguments are and the logic behind them, the type of reasoning that's important. Okay, so let's take a look at these two little passages here in the middle of the screen. The one on the left says, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow. Therefore, it's going to rain tomorrow. The one on the right says, rain is one form of precipitation. Snow and hail are other types of precipitation. Okay, so what's going on here? These two passages have some things in common. So they're both somehow about rain and they're both short. But they're also different in a very fundamental and important way. The first passage is organized so that the first statement gives us reason to believe that the second statement is true. The first statement supports the second. But we don't see any similar relationship in the second passage where neither of the two sentences support one another. They don't give any reason to believe that the other one is true. In those situations where one statement supports another, where one statement gives us reason to think that the other one is true, that's an argument. The first passage is an argument, and the second is just a collection of statements. None of them support the rest. None of the statements support the rest. And you'll find both arguments and collections of statements in the argument section, but the overwhelming majority of questions are going to deal with arguments. Okay, so now let's focus on our argument. So we actually have a special name for these statements. The statement that the arguer wants us to think is true is called the conclusion. And the statement that gives us a reason that supports the conclusion is called a premise. So in this case, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow. That's a premise. And therefore, it's going to rain tomorrow is a conclusion. The very first thing that you need to be able to do when you're presented with an argument is to be able to break it down into conclusions and premises. And the best way of doing that is by looking for what we call indicators. Conclusion indicators are words that let us know or that indicate that the statement that follows is a conclusion. And premise indicators are words that let us know that the statement that follows is a premise. Some arguments have both types of indicators, some have only one, and some don't have any. Okay, like I said, the second sentence is the conclusion, and we see that the first word is therefore. Therefore is one of the most common conclusion indicators. Whenever we see it, we immediately know that what we're reading is a conclusion. Of course, it's not the only one. Other words also commonly appear on the LSAT arguments to indicate conclusions. So taking a look at this other short passage that we put up, it says, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow. As a result, it's going to rain tomorrow. Now this means the same exact thing. These two passages mean the same exact thing. The only difference is that it's using different words to point to the conclusion. This one is saying, as a result, as opposed to therefore. Okay, we have a list of words that are commonly used on the LSAT to indicate a conclusion. There are consequently, thus, it follows that, accordingly, it shows that, for this reason, in conclusion, hence, so. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other words in the English language that can be used to indicate a conclusion, but these words appear most often on the LSAT, so it will be a good idea to become familiar with them so that you'll be able to quickly identify the conclusion and the premises. Okay, so let's take a look back at the passage. We see it's slightly changed. It says, because the weather report said it will have rain tomorrow, it's going to rain tomorrow. Once again, this is the same argument that we've been using all along. The only change is that I've placed the statement all in one sentence so that it sounds more natural, and I've added the word because. The premises and the conclusions don't have to be separate sentences. You can have them in the same sentence. In this case, we still have the same premise and the same conclusion, but we no longer have a conclusion indicator, we have a premise indicator. And this works the same way. It lets us know which of the statements are premises and which is the conclusion. And because is one of the most common premise indicators. And just like for the conclusion indicator, we have other words that also function as premise indicators. So take a look at this passage that we just put up. It says, since the weather report said it will have rain tomorrow, it's going to rain tomorrow. Now this, once again, means the same exact thing, and we still have the same premises and the same conclusion. So taking a look at our little list, it says, given that, due to, for, as can be seen by, the reason being, in that. So once again, same as for the conclusion indicators, this is not an exhaustive list, but it is a good idea to become familiar with them. Okay, so going back to our original little argument. Now, a useful way of representing an argument is to diagram it. When you diagram an argument, you separate the premises and the conclusion into individual statements and then draw a line between the premises and conclusion. So in this case, we have the weather report said we'll have rain tomorrow up on top, and it's going to rain tomorrow underneath the line. Now here the first statement is our premise, and the statement below the line is the conclusion. Diagramming the argument like this makes its structure and the logical relationships between the premises and the conclusion more obvious. As our arguments become more complicated, you'll see how useful that is. Okay, so now look, we've changed the wording in the argument a little bit. Now it reads, therefore, since the weather report said that we're going to have rain tomorrow, it's going to rain tomorrow. Now, this is actually the same argument that we've been using all along. The change is that this one sentence has both a premise indicator, therefore, and a conclusion indicator, since, and it's awkwardly worded. It's not obvious what's the premise and what's the conclusion. This is actually a tricky variation where a conclusion indicator is immediately followed by a premise indicator. And the part immediately following the premise indicator is the premise, and the part following the premise is the conclusion. So we have, therefore, since the weather report said it will have rain tomorrow, which is a premise, it's going to rain tomorrow, it's our conclusion. And you should pay attention to this because it'll come up on the test, the therefore since. Now when we diagram it, we have here, same as before, weather report said we'll have rain tomorrow, it's going to rain tomorrow. Sentence starts with therefore, indicating that a conclusion is coming up, but it immediately throws in a premise in between the two commas to support the conclusion that hasn't been mentioned yet. And like I said, this is something that's going to come up enough on the test that you should pay attention to it. Okay, now let's take a look at how we've changed the passage once again. It says, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow. It's going to rain tomorrow. Once again, this is the same argument that we've been using all along. But there are no premise indicators or conclusion indicators to help us identify the premises and the conclusion. Now, this is not unusual for LSAT arguments to omit indicators. In that situation, simply place premise and conclusion indicators in front of the statements that we think are premises and conclusions and see if the passage makes sense. Usually, it's best to simply put therefore for conclusion indicators and because for the premise indicator, and to start with the statement you think is the conclusion. So we would change it to say, therefore, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow. It's going to rain tomorrow. And if we diagram that, it says it's going to rain tomorrow, and underneath, the weather report said we'll have rain tomorrow. So the way we have it here is if, for example, we thought that the first statement was the conclusion, and then we simply put a therefore in front of it. But in this case, that doesn't make much sense, because if we're going to have rain tomorrow, that's not a reason to think that the weather report said that it'll rain tomorrow. That simply doesn't make sense. So that's what you need to do. You need to look at it and see if it makes any sense. Now we reversed it. Now we said the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow, therefore it's going to rain tomorrow. But here we switched the two sentences, and we have the conclusion indicator in front of the second sentence, and we have it to read, the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow, therefore it's going to rain tomorrow. And when we diagram it, it says weather report said we'll have rain tomorrow, followed by a line, and then it's going to rain tomorrow. So if we thought the second sentence was the conclusion and put therefore in front of it, we now see that this makes much more sense. If the weather report said that we'll have rain tomorrow, then that's a good reason for us to believe that it's going to rain tomorrow. Notice that in both these examples, we only put in the conclusion indicator, and sometimes that'll be enough. In this case, the argument is simple enough, so it works like that without a problem. Okay, so to recap quickly, an argument is a collection of sentences where you have a conclusion and a premise. A conclusion is a statement that the person making the argument wants you to think is true, and a premise is a statement that gives you a reason to think that the conclusion is true. It supports the conclusion. In order to figure out which of the statements is the conclusion and which is a premise, you need to look for conclusion and premise indicators. If there are no indicators, you can insert them in order to test out the statements and see which one makes sense. Okay, continuing on, let's take a look at this new argument. It says the weatherman said that we'll have 3 days of rain. He's almost always right, and it rained yesterday and today. Hence, we're going to have rain tomorrow as well. We've been using the same argument all along, where we had one premise and one conclusion, but of course, an argument doesn't have to be in that form. You can have any number of premises. Here we see that we have 3 premises. This is important to keep in mind because virtually all of the arguments that you encounter in the LSAT are going to have more than one premise. So here we'll diagram it. And we'll say weatherman said we'll have 3 days of rain. He's almost always right. It rained yesterday and today. And then the conclusion underneath, it's going to rain tomorrow. So that's our diagram. The 3 premises provide support for the conclusion. And if you notice in the third premise, it starts off with the word and. You can think of that premise, as well as the third one, as information that's added to the first premise to make the support for the conclusion even stronger. A lot of arguments have that basic structure, where the individual premises add further information to strengthen the support for the conclusion. Let's take a look at this argument. It says, the weatherman said that we'll have 3 days of rain. He's almost always right about snowfall, but he's usually wrong when making rain predictions. Hence, we're probably not going to have rain tomorrow. Now, if we diagram this one, we have the 3 sentences again in the conclusion underneath. But here we've changed the argument slightly, and if you notice, the third premise begins with a but. This is the other common type of premise called a disjunctive premise, since it presents information that casts into doubt previous information. In this case, saying that the weatherman is usually wrong about rain predictions makes us reconsider the information that he predicted 3 days of rain, and it is the main support for the conclusion that we won't have rain. Unlike the previous basic premise type that simply adds new info, this premise adds new info that contrasts with previous info. Okay, let's take a look at this argument. It says, the weatherman said that we'll have 3 days of rain. It rained yesterday and today. Therefore, we're going to have rain tomorrow, and the forecast has been correct so far. Well, we can also have more than one conclusion. The additional conclusion is that the forecast has been correct so far, since the weatherman said 3 days of rain and it rained yesterday and today. The 2 conclusions are separate from one another, and they're both supported by the 2 premises at the beginning of the passage. You can have as many conclusions as you want, as long as they're supported by the other statements. So the way we would diagram that is we would have the 2 premises, the line, and then underneath we would have the 2 conclusions. So here we have the 2 premises and the 2 conclusions. The 2 premises support the 2 conclusions independently. You can have a complete argument with the 2 premises and either one of the conclusions. Let's take a look at this argument. It says the weatherman said that we'll have 3 days of rain. It rained yesterday and today. Therefore, we're going to have rain tomorrow as well. So as a result, we won't be able to play tennis. You can have a conclusion supported by another conclusion. We have our original 2 premises and conclusion, but we also have a second conclusion, that we won't be able to play tennis, that's supported by the original conclusion, that it's going to rain tomorrow as well. The first conclusion also acts as a premise, since it supports a conclusion. It gives us reason to think that it's true, and we can refer to it as a sub-conclusion. Sub-conclusions are important because they come up often in the arguments and they can get confusing, since it isn't always immediately obvious which is the sub-conclusion and which is the conclusion of the entire argument. Now, the way we have it here, we have the 2 premises, then a line, then the sub-conclusion, marked by SC, and then the overall conclusion. So the last line, that we won't be able to play tennis, is the main conclusion, and the line right above it, that we're going to have rain tomorrow, is the main support for that conclusion. The fact that we're going to have rain tomorrow is reason to believe that we won't be able to play tennis. In addition, we're given reasons to believe that we're going to have rain tomorrow. The first 2 lines act as support for that, and we can think of that third line as a sub-conclusion. It's a sub-conclusion because it's supported by other statements, but it also supports another statement. Now, arguments will also have implied premises or assumptions. The argument concludes that we won't be able to play tennis because we're going to have rain tomorrow, but the unstated assumption is that if there's rain, then we won't be able to play tennis. So we could diagram that by adding an A for assumption, and it says that if there's rain, then we can't play tennis. So there's a bit of a gap between the subconclusion and the conclusion in this argument. Saying that we're going to have rain tomorrow doesn't necessarily mean that we won't be able to play tennis. You have to make an assumption that rain prevents us from playing tennis. The basic kinds of assumptions or implied premises are those that bridge the gap between the premises and the conclusion. Now let's take a look at this argument. Experts say that there has been increased flooding in the past couple of years. Unfortunately for us, the weatherman said that we'll have 3 days of rain. It rained so hard that yesterday and today that most of the trees were uprooted. So it looks like we're going to have rain tomorrow as well. The arguments that we've been using as examples are much simpler than the ones that you will encounter in the test. In the actual test, the arguments are going to have wordier sentences and additional information that won't necessarily be required to identify the structure of the argument. The basic structure of this argument is the same as in all the previous simpler ones. The argument is still the same. The conclusion is that there's going to be rain tomorrow, and it's based on the weatherman's prognosis in the 2 days of rain. But here we see that the first sentence isn't relevant at all to the argument. It adds new information that doesn't have any relationship with the conclusion. And the second sentence also adds new elements, with the word unfortunately to add emotion. And the third sentence also adds information that isn't relevant to the argument by saying that most of the trees were uprooted. And so you'll get a lot of this on the actual LSAT, where it won't be just clear and simple premises and conclusions. So to recap once again, arguments can have multiple premises and conclusions. They can also have subconclusions which are supported by other conclusions in the argument. And actual arguments on the LSAT will be worded slightly more complicatedly and with additional irrelevant information.